ask them both a few questions, and get a bit of chat going with them. So I'm going to start off with Fiona. Fiona, people maybe don't know what the Pandemic Response Group for Social Care is, and not surprising, there are so many of these groups. This one is particularly important though, I think. Can you tell us a bit about the group and your involvement in it?
Yeah. Well, we were asked by Shabana back in September 2021 to join the group, and we hadn't heard of it either before that. But the group's been meeting since September 2020, and it was set up as a successor to the Care Homes Rapid Action Group. So that was a group obviously set up to respond to the immediate crisis within the care homes. But then in September it was decided to change the group a bit, but to keep it going. So really, it's a multi-stakeholder focal point. I'm reading from this. Multi-stakeholder focal point for work to deliver adult social care during the pandemic. So it's a high-level group, as Claire was saying. It links with other groups, like the Clinical Professional Advisory Group, and there's an even more high-level group called the Goal Group. We're not quite sure who all sits on the Goal Group, but it links with that as well and gets reports from that group, and it can escalate issues up to Scottish ministers. So the objectives are to enhance collaborative working across adult social care leaders, to share intelligence, identify key issues that continue to hamper recovery from COVID-19 and which are related to the pandemic, and to ensure learning from the pandemic shapes the future of adult social care as the sector recovers. Doesn't feel much like there's a recovery going on right now, but that's the aim. And the remit are it's shared intelligence to identify new issues that require action and a response and future planning. And there are short life working groups to deal with particular issues, and they report into the group. So there's a lot of information sharing, and there's a representation from the group where people it's chaired jointly by the Scottish Government and COSLA, and mostly it's had a Scottish Government chair. There's Health Board Chief Executives, Health Improvement Scotland, Care Inspectorate, Coalition of Carers, Scottish Care, SSSC, Public Health Scotland, lots of professional advisors to the Scottish Government. So when we were asked to join the group in September, we saw this email list of about 70 people, and we thought, oh, good God, how are we ever going to get a chance to talk at this group? And we were given an invitation to join the group the day before a meeting. So I don't think anyone from the group really expected us to join that particular meeting. But we arrived and found actually we were able to contribute, and we have been contributing. And initially there was going to be one space in the group, and then it was two spaces, and so three of us were asked to join so that we could fill those spaces. But actually, mostly three of us have been at the meetings, and nobody said no. So that's we've certainly been able to get our voice across, I think, and right from the word go. We're still kind of working out sometimes who's who in the group. But as Claire was saying, I think we've managed to have an influence, because I think what we brought to the group is that kind of reality check. This is actually what's happening out there on the ground, and this is actually how carers are feeling. Because I think that it's very easy for people in these high level meetings to feel that things are going okay, and perhaps not really in touch with what's actually happening on the ground, and the shortage of services out there, and the impact that's having, and how it's leaving carers and how it's leaving people out there. So I think that's what we brought to that meeting is that real knowledge of what's happening out there, and I think it has changed the conversation in the group.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you again for the time that you all put into it. And I know you're all from different areas, different caring roles. I think that's really important as well. You've got bringing different perspectives to the group. I'm going to ask Michael a question now. So I know that in the group you have been kind of advocating for carers and suggesting ways in which the government needs to support carers. Can you tell us a bit about, what sort of things are on the agenda, Michael, and what sort of things have you been saying that, you think they should be doing for carers?
Yes. Hi, thank you. I remember getting the email and the phone call from Shabana about participating in the group, and I was standing in a garden centre at the time, and maybe I should have just continued to buy my pansies and petunias But no, it's been a really worthwhile process, and I think what we've tried to do is engage kind of positively in a spirit of partnership with the officers who are on the group. Our feedback has actually been both in the group itself, which meets monthly, but more often as required. So over the winter period in particular, we've had more frequent meetings. But we've also had the opportunity to provide written feedback and supplementary written submissions at a couple of points, which I think has been important because that's allowed us to expand our position and cover more issues. And we've also had a few side meetings. A lot of it has been about, as Fiona was saying, about actually just highlighting what it's been like at the coalface for carers, and making sure that that perspective is brought to these discussions. So all the issues that we're well aware of about the lack of care and services, the fact that the Scottish Government will say, you'll get a letter through that says social care is open, but it doesn't say by how much it is open. And actually, it might not be open very much, depending on the situation. The problems that we've had with, hospital discharges, people being left with very little or no care, the impact in care or home services. The problems with self-directed support, the fact that the guidance that was there with regard to supposedly having a very flexible approach and being able to employ relatives, clearly that's not been applied uniformly and hasn't been the same in all areas. The problems about hospital situation where the person you care for has actually had to go into hospital, and whether again the guidance that is there has been applied uniformly so that carers can go in and provide that support. So we've been able to highlight these issues. In terms of, I think, kind of, if you like, specific asks and maybe specific wins, one of the things that we were quite strongly advocating for over the winter period was for there to be, if you like, quick, direct assistance to carers who were in particularly acute situations. So that was to be administered with, if you like, the minimum of bureaucracy, the minimum of fuss, maximum flexibility, directly administered, preferably through carer centres. And I'm sure we were adding to the calls from other organisations, but since then we had the Winter Fund, which was £4 million. We could have done with a lot more than that, but that £4 million, most of it distributed through carer centres, with the idea that that would actually provide direct, quick assistance to those most in need. We also asked, for example, with regard to self-directed support, that authorities be reminded about that existing guidance so that they actually try to ensure that people were able to use their funds flexibly, were able to employ relatives. And again, just within the last couple of weeks, I think there was guidance issued in connection with STS. But I think importantly through it all, we have been advocating, like others, for this carer recovery plan. The winter plan that was issued just before Christmas didn't actually contain a lot directly for unpaid carers. There was a lot in there that would have maybe have been of indirect assistance. So the increases in pay rates for paid carers might have been of indirect assistance, but there was nothing really in there that was going to be of direct assistance to carers. So we were very much advocating for a co-produced carer recovery plan with the kind of the short and the medium-term, long-term actions to actually support recovery and actually get more meaningful measures quickly in place for carers. So I think through the discussions, and again, trying to be positive and constructive, we've achieved some progress, but there's a long, long way to go. And thankfully now we're seeing the beginnings of that with the carer strategy.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. And maybe not many people did know about your role in getting the £4 million. So there's so many carers that have been supported through that. So again, thanks for that and being such great advocates for carers through that. Moving on then to the development of the National Care Strategy. Firstly, the short-term measures, and you've picked on that already a bit, Michael. I know some of the things that you have suggested to the Pandemic Recovery Group, but if I go to Fiona and ask, what would you say are the priorities in terms of short-term recovery in terms of the care strategy?
Well, I think a lot of it was obviously covered in what you were presenting earlier, Claire. What I would hope for is that in the carers recovery strategy, carer strategy, there's recognition that goes beyond lip service to the vital contribution that unpaid carers have made during the pandemic, because I do think that that's really often been lost. There's clapping for nurses, which is great, and I think there's a recognition that social care staff have been under the cosh, and £500 was given, but unpaid carers have really carried people through the pandemic. Wherever everybody else has failed and fallen by the wayside, it's unpaid carers who've picked all that up, and it's unpaid carers who've really struggled through this time, and it's been traumatic, really. And I would hope that a carer strategy really recognises that, and recognises that in the short term that carers really need time. There needs to be recovery time, and there needs to be recovery support for carers. And we're not really in a position to be able to recover all that much right now, because the numbers are still, the infection rates are still really high, and there are lots of people out there still having to, to isolate, and carers are having to do that as well to keep people safe. But in terms of that impact that the pandemic's had on carers, then I think it's that recognition that it's not just a case of throwing money at carer centres for short breaks, that there's much more needed than that, and things like workplaces opening up again, and carers then faced with that dilemma about going into workplaces, and what does that mean, and how does that keep the care for person safe. And it's that kind of responding to carers in the midst of this, and making sure that they're involved in those decisions, and that decisions really take account of carers' particular needs, and the kind of health checks that you're speaking about, and mental health support, and support in other ways. So it's that immediate short-term response to unpaid carers' needs to recover from all this. For me personally, a big issue has been charging for social care support. It's that's been something that has been a bugbear for a long time. There was the review of adult social care that recommended that charging end. The Scottish Government voted to end charging, but there are people like myself where charging has still been in place throughout the pandemic for support that hasn't been in place or can't be in place, and there's no time scale as yet for charging to end. So for me, that's a short term priority that really needs to, we really need to see a time scale for that happening now in the planning for that. COVID recovery planning, I think I'd like to see that really underpinned by human rights and equalities legislation, because the COVID recovery, lots of people out there rejoicing that they can go out to football matches and concerts and all that kind of thing. But for carers, it's and disabled people, and there's still people trying to get to enter any kind of social opportunities again, who've been isolating for 2 years and still really trying to find a way through that. So in terms of COVID recovery planning, I'd be hoping that a carer strategy can help navigate a way through that for carers, to make sure that their rights are upheld during all this. SDS budgets, we're at the time of year where local authorities are clawing back money, unspent money from budgets, without recognising that actually there's unspent money in budgets because needs haven't been met, because there's been nothing to spend the money on. So why not use that money to help with people's recovery? But instead, local authorities are taking that money back. So I'd hope that a carers recovery strategy can quickly address that, so that people don't lose that, and that discussions are really about how to use that money flexibly. And immediate investment in social care to address the current shortages, because it's critical out there. We don't have enough social care to meet needs, and where's the planning to really address that in the short term? The National Care Service might hopefully in the longer term lead to improvements there, but right now is where people need that investment, and so I'd hope that a carer strategy can help flag that up and make something happen there to address the immediate needs.
Thanks, Fiona. There's a lot on that. And I just wanted to pick up on one of the things you said, which was, and Michael mentioned as well, which is around the SDS COVID guidance being extended and reviewed. We did some research on that as well, looking at how it was being applied across Scotland. So I'm just going to ask Shabana to put the links in the chat box so people can have a look at that, because I think it's a really important point. It's like you've been saying about a lot of the measures, what the good intentions don't always follow through for all carers. So it's really important to note that. And also just as things move forward and freedoms are opened up for everybody else, that, you know, we think carer at every stage to make sure, well, how does this impact on carers, and is this freedom for them, or is it actually sometimes making things less open for them? So really important. I'm just going to read a couple of messages in the chat box. Carol Kelly says, many thanks to Fiona and Michael for representing carers so brilliantly. And Linda says, thanks to Michael and Fiona for all your support for carers. So I just wanted you to know that, you know, people really appreciate the time that you're putting in and what you're bringing to the meetings. But I'm going to go to Michael now, and just you've brilliantly kind of outlined maybe what needs to happen in terms of the short-term measures, Fiona. Michael, in terms of medium term, so things that might take a wee bit longer but are really important as well for the care strategy, what would you say are the priorities?
I think it's hard to isolate priorities. There's just so much that needs to be done, and I think that's the challenge when you look at the strategy, is that when we look to the medium to longer term, there are just so many measures that I think most carers would say are necessary. And I think there is a tendency perhaps to link all of those to the National Care Service development. And I think that's something that I think we should be a bit cautious about, because although, you know, we know that that work is in process, perhaps not all of the measures should wait or be totally dependent on the National Care Service development. A lot of my points, I think, are echoed in your own presentation, but I think with regard to carer finance, that clearly is a big issue for so many carers. And I noted that the consultation came out yesterday on the Scottish equivalent for the Scottish replacement for carers allowance. And we need to look, there are obviously big issues in there for a lot of carers about things like the number of hours, the hours threshold that requires to be met, the earnings threshold that's there. Point, I think someone actually raised it in the chat about what happens when a carer reaches pension age. The fact that you can be caring for somebody for, you know, 35, 40 years, but then actually when you get to pension age, carers allowance would stop. I think it should also look at, and I think this is important in a number of respects, issues to do with shared caring. I think the system's very much based upon a situation where it's almost presumed that one person is providing all the care, and how do you deal with situations where that is split. So I think in general terms, the whole question about finance and the financial situation of carers is obviously something that needs to be addressed. I think for me, services and support is really important. Both the support and services to carers and also those we care for, because the two are very much linked. We've talked about short breaks, and I think we have to be very careful as we go through the next few years as well, that actually not just that, if you like, to protect even the capacity that is there, because I think there is a risk that services will be reconfigured or perhaps will be lost because of other financial pressures, that we need to ensure that actually those services are retained. There's been quite a lot of publicity latterly about day services, and the fact that some day services have not been reopened and have moved towards community supports. And I think, if you like, certainly in the short term, I think we would all agree that recovery from the pandemic should not be used as almost like a Trojan horse for cuts in care or reshaping care. So I think we need to both look at protecting our existing services, as well as making sure that, if you like, we develop those options for short breaks in the future. And SDS clearly is going to be a part of that. I think further development of SDS to make sure that that people are trusted, that actually ultimately people know themselves how best to use their funds to achieve their outcomes. There's a far greater degree of trust in the system, that budgets are appropriate to provide actually real choice. That the fact that, if you like, you know, how does the council calculate the budget that somebody gets through SDS, so that we actually, as we go forward, look at actually how you determine the budget in the first place. And I think there's a bit of market development that should take place as well, about actually ensuring that there are services and support to buy. that will link into the workforce issues that you've talked about. But again, for some people, they maybe have a budget, but actually they can't spend it because there aren't services there for people. So we need to actually look at that. Health and well-being of carers. Again, you spoke a bit about that clear in your presentation. Again, I would agree with a lot of that. Again, as Longford, I hope I'm not going to offend people by saying we need more than kind of mindfulness and yoga. Whilst, you know, I'm sure that's important and helpful for some, we need a lot more than that. And the measures that you've spoken about, I think particularly about health and kind of preventative checks. For I think most carers, you're very guilty about always just concentrating on the need of the person that you're looking after and not looking after your own needs. So this idea of actually facilitating replacement care so that carers can go for appointments and having regular checks, etc., I think is very important. Perhaps even in some instances, ability to fast track appointments and having a system for that. And my final point was just going to be about, making sure that we're not in this situation again. We've all gone through so much, and in some ways it's been a surprise that actually there wasn't more of a contingency plan in place. So we need to make sure that whatever else happens, we're in a better place going forward when we get the next pandemic, which hopefully won't be for a few years yet.
Thanks, Michael. Let's hope not. And thank you for that. It does chime with quite a lot of what we've been saying, but I think you've said it really eloquently and really kind of focused in on some of the really important stuff going forward. Now we're almost out of time for this session, so I'm just going to put you on the spot slightly and ask you both to maybe think, sort of say one thing that you think is going to be really important to make sure that the carers strategy and pandemic recovery has an impact. So what's your top thing that you think may not be a measure, it may just be something that needs to happen to make sure that it's it works for carers and it actually has an impact. So I'll go to Fiona first. So Michael, what do we think?
It's hard to say one thing, but I think what it really needs is clear timelines and for progress to be reviewed and for that to be built in the timelines, because so often these strategies, they turn into bits of paper that go out there that don't actually make much of a difference, but everybody feels good because they're there. So I think what we really need is to have that clarity about reviewing progress and to make sure that all meetings, involve unpaid carers, so that it's not just simply people at a high level reviewing progress and thinking that they've met needs. To make sure that that we're there as it's being reviewed.
Thanks, Fiona. And Michael?
I think we need money. I think fundamentally, yes, there's a lot that we can do without increasing resources, but equally, there's a lot that we can't do without more money, and this needs to be backed by resources. We need to get that commitment, and that commitment needs to flow through, if you like, Scottish Government and the HSCPs and down to local authorities.
Thanks, Michael. I think if we combine those two, if you have timescales clear about what you're going to do, you have the money, and then you check to see if you've done it, that's pretty much it in a nutshell, isn't it? So thank you both for that. I'm just going to finally end with a comment from the chat box. Fiona and Michael, thank you so much for doing all that you're doing for carers. Government and councils will do well to listen to everything you're saying. I feel very reassured having you there. So thank you both very much. I'm going to hand over to Shabana now. I think is going to talk to